In my last video, I completed all the sub-assemblies on Revell's Dune Ornithopter and completed the majority of the painting. Today is a different story though. It's a nightmare of fidgety wiring, brittle plastic, and the universe daring me to get this model to the finish line. It's all coming up next on Scale Icons. In the Vintage Build series, I dip into my photographic archives to show you how I built some of my favorite models, years before I started this channel. Today it's part 3 of my Dune Ornithopter build. If you're just joining me now, you can find a link to the other parts of this series in the description below. It was time to tackle the most critical point of the Ornithopter project, installing the custom lighting system. The Ornithopter design really doesn't have any lighting features, but I've always felt that nothing brings a science fiction model to life like lighting does. My inspiration was a brief line from Frank Herbert's original novel that painted a picture of a dim, dark cockpit illuminated only by green dials and screens. The art direction from the 1984 film pays homage to this, I think. To recreate this effect, Madman Lighting provided me with their deluxe 24 flasher board and a collection of green LEDs. First, I carefully threaded fiber optics into the pre-drilled holes I had already made on the instrument panel, as well as the 2 vertical posts in the port and starboard observation rooms. The light sources for the fibers would be located in the very narrow space between the cockpit floor and the bottom of the fuselage. This meant relatively short lengths of fiber, which also meant I had to be extra careful not to inadvertently yank them out of their sockets. Next, I installed 2 small LEDs into the rear of the instrument panel. I had pre-wired these in a daisy chain, as they would both be wired to the same flicker circuit. When covered with the tiny monitor casings I'd built, they should give the appearance of flickering monitor screens. Finally, I installed LEDs in the 2 ceiling lamps that would be mounted just above the hatch. I used small pieces of brass micromesh from Scale Scenics to cover the clear styrene lenses. Not only would this cut down the brightness to a more realistic level, I'd hoped some interesting shadows might be created in the process. The brass contrasted beautifully with the dark gunmetal paint scheme, especially since I'd used brass paint for some details on the instrument panel. I was so inspired, I deviated from my design slightly and sparingly added a few more bits of micromesh to dress up the rest of the cockpit. Moment of truth time. The lighting test. If I damaged any wires, LEDs or fibers, this was when I'd find out. And if I did, I'd have to take that cockpit apart to fix them. I loosely attached the leads to the circuit board, hooked up the power supply, and held my breath. Success! With everything working correctly, it was time to close it all up. Before installing the cockpit and the instrument panel, I ran wires for the 2 light sources out through the forward, port, and starboard landing gear wells. Once the cockpit was in, there would be no room to do this afterwards. I had to carefully juggle the cockpit interior and the instrument panel with its mass of fibers and wires as I glued the 2 parts into the forward part of the fuselage. This took quite a bit of fussing around. Trying to keep everything straight without crimping any wires, well, let's just say this took me a lot more time than I planned. Carefully slipping on the back half of the fuselage, I applied glue and clamped it to dry, and with that, a major step in construction was completed. Next, I did some minor scratch building to replace the clunky and blobby looking tail guns and antennas that came with the model kit. There's no clear photo references for any of these parts. The filming miniature doesn't even seem to feature them. Yet the blueprints do show the guns and antennas in place all over the model. So, screen accuracy be damned, I reached for my spare parts box. For the lower tail guns, I added a pair of 1/48 scale 50 caliber barrels to the existing gun assembly. This created a larger and more robust set of weapons with a bit more science fiction flair. For the upper guns, I found an unused set of 1/35 scale M16 rifles still on the sprue tree. Antennas were even easier. I snipped the tips and bases off the kit parts and used some super glue to attach them to lengths of very fine wire. Well, that was easy. Next, the final weathering. This was mostly a judicious use of Model Master's new acrylic black detail wash. I'd never used this product before, but it was simple. I just applied it with a brush and I wiped it off with a damp cloth. Rather than pure black, it's more of an oily and grimy dark brown color. It created a very subtle enhancement to my previous weathering and gave some nice variation in the blacks I'd already laid down. But I decided that the semi-gloss panels on the fuselage needed a bit more contrast to give the illusion of scale. This was a simple fix. I just used artistic license once again and carefully airbrushed some panel lines with some heavily thinned aircraft interior black. The final step was some very light dry brushing of Model Master steel and Model Master jet exhaust to replicate wear on the landing gear, weapons, and antennas. With everything done, it was time for the most nerve-wracking phase, final assembly. After carefully running more wires from the fuselage through the booms and then down through the aft landing gear bays, the poor engineering of the kit struck again. The starboard boom fit perfectly, but the port side boom didn't properly join with the fuselage, leaving some nasty gaps I needed to fill. Still, I had more success fixing this than I did with the other gaps in the model. It was nearly complete, with only the rear landing gear remaining, and that's when I made the mistake of getting optimistic. I started by drilling 2 holes in the top and bottom of the landing gear thighs. The 2 wires exited these thighs at the back of the knee, right where I wanted them, just above the central spring I'd added during construction. Working very carefully, I threaded the wires into the tops of the springs, allowing them to emerge at the base of the ankle. I then carefully glued the thighs into their mounting points on the fuselage, being careful to ensure the correct angle was maintained. And that's when the starboard foot fell apart between my fingers. Close inspection revealed 3 tiny fractures in the delicate plastic. I re-glued and let the part sit another day. After the requisite time had passed, I resumed work on the wires. This time the port side foot broke into 4 pieces, and glue was among to help this time because one of the broken pieces was the flange that connected the foot to the ankle. Rather than throwing my hands in the air and rage quitting entirely, I decided to just rebuild the feet with some styrene stock. I reinforced the base and ankles and then inserted thin styrene rod to replace the nubs of the original part used for joints. 24 hours later, they were as good as new, better in fact, with a slightly higher level of detail. Patting myself on the back, I started to get ready to reattach them to the legs. This time, the plastic strut on the port calf cracked in 3 different areas, and no matter how much I tried, it was just not going back together. Worse, as I worked to prepare these joints with superglue, I accidentally brushed against the port leg, snapping it off of the knee, and leaving a thin strip of ragged plastic that would be exceptionally difficult to repair. I had 2 options. I could rip off all the gear and model the Thopter in flight, but with the fuselage already sealed up, I had no way of realistically mounting it without potentially causing fatal damage to the model. Besides, what would I do with all the wires coming out of the landing gear bays? My only real choice was to rebuild the calves from scratch. I used strip styrene, a hollow styrene tube to run both wires through and to slide the spring over, and a couple of lengths of steel wire, all to fabricate 2 new calves for each landing gear. And when I was done, they actually looked better than the kit parts. With the wires carefully threaded through the tubes, I began to glue everything back together, feet to calves, calves to knees. This time, the delicate framework of the starboard thigh cracked in 3 places. I'll admit it, I was ready to cry. At least the brakes were clean this time and easily repaired. All in all, I think I spent about a month trying to fix the legs. A careful spray of flat black hid all the damage and frustration, and the end result is probably more realistic looking than the original kit parts were. After the fun of LegFest 2019, I was keen to do the base. I needed to get my butt in gear. With Capcom 2019 only a few short weeks away, I still needed to build the groundwork for the base and to finish up the model.
Arrakis. Dune. Desert planet.
To create the desert groundwork, I mixed up a batch of Activa's fast Mache product and spread it out across the base. I gave it a good 24 hours to dry and set. Once everything was dry, I mixed another batch of fast Mache, thin and as soft as possible, as I needed to make impressions for the landing gear and footprints for the figures. But to do this successfully, I'd need to push the delicate landing gear down into it, and thread the wires through the base. And after the previous problems with the brittle landing gear, I was terrified of them breaking again.
I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer.
Turns out I had nothing to worry about. I let the second layer of groundwork dry for another 24 hours, and then I sealed everything with Model Master Desert Sand acrylic paint. Just painting the fast Mache made the base look too toy-like. Model Railroad Sand was the right color, but too gritty for the scale. I finally selected a fine sand that, to be honest, started life as tile grout. With the sand selected, I applied a coat of white glue thinned with water to the whole base, and then sifted the sand over it. I finished off by airbrushing a variety of acrylic paints to come up with a very Dune-like appearance. Once the paint was dry, I carefully pulled up the blue painter's tape that had been masking the base off for almost a year, and was overjoyed to see that my efforts had paid off. After mounting both the Thopter and the figure to the base with white glue, I hooked up wires to the circuit board in the base and then carefully attached the new guns as well as all the delicate antennas. The last step was a little bit of final weathering, courtesy of some rust-colored pastels from Tamiya. And not a minute too soon. After working on the Ornithopter for almost 2 years, I'd finished with less than 24 hours before the IPMS Ottawa Capcom 2019 model show. In the final part of this series, the Ornithopter will make its public debut. Don't forget to check out my other videos on Revell's Ornithopter. And if you enjoyed this one, please consider liking and subscribing. You've been watching Scale Icons, and I'll see you soon at the workbench.